Tonight on Politicat, repeated attempts at obstruction, highlights and takeaways from the redacted Mueller Report.
And Marathon Town Hall, we look at the performances of 5 Democratic candidates on CNN last night.
Plus, from acting to reality, a former comedian is now president of Ukraine.
Those stories and more tonight on Politicat.
It's your politics right now. Politicat, I'm Joey Safchik.
And I'm Justin Sweetwood. Lots of news to get to this week, so let's get right into it. A decision on whether to release President Trump's tax returns has been delayed until May 6th. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said today that the Treasury and Justice Departments were determining if the House's request for the returns was legal. He cited privacy concerns in a letter to the House Ways and Means Committee. The committee's deadline was 5 Eastern today, though it was not legally binding. It was the committee's third such deadline. The White House said earlier today that it did not plan to release the returns.
And on the other side of the world, the Islamic State claimed responsibility today for Sunday's suicide bombings in Sri Lanka. But the claim has not been confirmed. Over 300 people were killed at 3 hotels and 3 churches during Easter Sunday masses. The Sri Lankan government admitted that it was warned about possible attacks and didn't act on these direct warnings. Religious tensions have risen as Christians lash out against Muslims.
Saudi Arabia said today that it executed 37 people for terrorism-related crimes. The country's official news agency tweeted that the men were convicted for adopting extremist ideologies, forming terrorist cells, and sparking conflict between religious groups. Activists say that nearly all of those executed were members of the country's Shia Muslim minority. Human rights organization Amnesty International said that confessions were extracted through torture. This is Saudi Arabia's largest mass execution since 2016.
A redacted version of Robert Mueller's report was released last Thursday. The special counsel's investigation examined Russian interference into the 2016 election and possible obstruction of justice by President Trump. The report states that Russia thought it would benefit from a Trump presidency, and the Trump campaign believed it would benefit symbiotically from Russian interference. But the report determined Trump's associates didn't participate in a criminal conspiracy. Trump tweeted that this grants him, quote, total exoneration. But the report said if the president, quote, clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, they would have explicitly said so. Further, the report didn't rule out the possibility that evidence of criminal wrongdoing by Trump's campaign does exist after all. To unpack this, I'd like to welcome our panel, NNN's legal analyst Virginia Langmaid and Vice President of College Democrats Uzair Kadir. So, what do we make of the report? Virginia, you've read the whole thing, 448 pages.
I have.
What'd you learn?
448 pages, some redactions here and there. I think maybe the standout takeaway from this report is just how much more there is to do after this report. That this report should function as a starting place for how we think about the security of our elections and how we think about the candidates we elect, not an end point. Starting from the very beginning, you have in the first 30 pages indications that there was a group of Russian nationals who were working on U.S. soil as early as spring 2014 online to try and manipulate or pose some sort of online campaign with regards to American elections. So I think that that really sort of raises questions of how far back do we go with responsibility for what we've seen, because the report is definitive that there was some degree of interference.
Is there?
Right, so going off that, I agree that there's a lot to do after the report, and I think in deciding what to do after the report, there's sort of a tension between maintaining institutional legitimacy by perhaps taking certain actions on these obstruction claims that might be necessary to preserve these institutions, but at the same time adjusting for the fact that there might be political backlash that would also weaken those same institutions if certain actions were to be taken. And I think that's the tension that Nancy Pelosi, for example, is wrestling with in her decision about whether or not to pursue impeachment.
Now, parts of the report seem to indicate that some members of the Trump campaign didn't necessarily oppose Russian interference in the Clinton campaign, and a member of Trump's legal team said that anyone would take information from an opponent. Is this a solid moral and political standpoint, and do morals even matter anymore? Is it worth talking about them?
Well, in terms of whether morals matter or not, I would say that the political dynamic of the country has become so polarized that morals can't really matter, because in order to have a moral discussion, we need to have a basic agreement on the facts of the case. And I think what polling makes very clear is that a large portion of this country just doesn't agree with what the facts of the case are, with many of Trump's associates and Trump himself decrying this investigation as fake news. And then in terms of whether or not this was moral or not, I think the answer is clearly no. I think that if you're running for president of the United States, you should want to be elected on the behalf of your appeal to the American people, not on the behalf of your appeal to a foreign power that then seeks to elevate you on their behalf.
I would say that in general, it is unwise for a campaign to accept this sort of assistance or accept this sort of relationship. I think that the main thing that the Trump campaign had going for them was the lack of intent, that's what separates what the conclusion of the report is from an actual charge of cooperation or conspiracy. That there was no intent to swing the election, that there was no scheduled movement between the two groups, despite the fact that they were communicating clearly, as you can see, and as we've seen in the indictments of Paul Manafort and in Michael Cohen. That is something that we've known for a while. I think you're on very thin ice if then you're only relying on having the moral high ground because you didn't mean to, because it wasn't the intent to commit criminal conspiracy. So no, I wouldn't recommend it, and I don't know that this is a stage to which we should advance all campaigning in the future.
Now that the investigation has concluded, Democrats must decide whether to pursue impeachment. Speaker Nancy Pelosi said she wants to move on from the issue, but presidential candidate Kamala Harris said she's still interested in pursuing it. Virginia, what do you think the Democrats' best strategy is here moving forward?
Well, I think it's interesting because you cite Nancy Pelosi and then Kamala Harris. I think that Nancy Pelosi maybe has an easier path to pursuing impeachment than Kamala Harris has to pursuing removal from office. With pursuing impeachment, essentially you have a Democratic House, and you have some evidence that there was some sort of unusual degree to which this election was pursued, that there was Russian interference, as we've seen. That's a clearer path to me because that is what we've seen in there. The failure of Robert Mueller to charge the president with any crime means that it would be very difficult to make a removal from office claim. That's an extreme to which we've never gone in this country, and I don't see it happening. I think at this point it really comes down to politics. What does Nancy Pelosi see as politically advantageous, not just for Democrats in the House, but for her specifically? She has to win a re-election too.
And that's my next question is, what role do the imminent campaigns play in this?
So I would say that the imminent campaigns sort of color whether or not we can really take, for example, Kamala Harris's view on this issue seriously, not in terms of whether or not it's a serious position that she's taking, but in terms of whether or not she would be taking this position were she in, for example, Nancy Pelosi's position, rather than in the position of campaigning for 2020.
We're going to leave it right there. We'll be right back with more Politicat.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Go Northwestern, break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
Now let's send it over to Justin, who's standing by with this week's Money Minute.
Thanks, Joey. Before we get into last night's series of Democratic town halls, we're going to take an in-depth look at one candidate's policy proposal that has been making headlines. On Monday, Massachusetts Senator and presidential hopeful Elizabeth Warren released a $1.25 trillion plan that would eliminate tuition and fees at 2- and 4-year public universities. It would also cancel student loan debt for more than 95% of Americans. Those with household incomes less than $100,000 would have up to $50,000 in debt canceled, with a smaller total forgiven as household income approaches $250,000. The latter group would not be eligible for debt forgiveness. Warren also wants to expand Pell Grant funding by $100 billion over the next 10 years and create a $50 billion fund for historically black colleges and universities and minority-serving institutions. Now, how exactly is this going to be paid for? Warren envisions a wealth tax on the ultra-rich, which would subject households worth more than $50 million to pay a 2% annual tax, and those making more than $1 billion to pay a 3% tax. While this may sound nice to many Americans, the constitutionality of said wealth tax is up for debate. It all hinges upon the definition of a direct tax, which has never been provided. The Constitution states that no direct tax can be levied unless it collects an equal amount per capita in each state, except in the case of an income tax. And whether the wealth tax falls under the umbrella of a direct tax has also never been settled. It will almost certainly reach the nation's highest court if Warren makes it to the White House. Let's send it back to the desk.
Thanks, Justin. Now, Senator Warren discussed that wealth tax during a CNN town hall on Monday night. The town hall featured 4 other Democratic candidates, Senators Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, and Amy Klobuchar, and South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg. All the questions came from college students. The town hall covered a range of topics, from felons voting to impeachment. As the Democratic field is already so large, it featured only a fraction of the declared candidates. The 5 candidates who spoke are all currently polling in the top and middle of the field. Now, to analyze this further, we're bringing back our panel, and we have Mia Mamone from North by Northwestern replacing Virginia. So it's still very early in the campaign. How much do these Democratic candidates really have to gain or lose from these town halls right now?
I don't know if they necessarily have that much to lose, but I think they certainly have a lot to gain. I think Elizabeth Warren has gained a lot of traction just from what happened last night. She's obviously been a front runner for a long time, but I think this is really kind of catapulting her even further than before.
So I would agree that these town halls are incredibly significant in terms of their potential effect, but I'm not sure how much control the candidates actually have over what that effect is. Insofar as we've seen, especially in 2016, that a large part of what forms a candidate's success is sort of the media and internet, like memosphere narrative that coalesces around that candidate. And that narrative does build off of early news events like these town halls. However, it can also sort of spread out quite unpredictably. So trying to pursue a specific path of action in these town halls might not necessarily be a possibility, even though they will end up being quite consequential to their overall campaign.
So I'm curious what you said about social media and this younger demographic. What was the significance of having college students really leading this town hall last night?
Well, I would say that I'm not so sure how significant it really was, given that this is still not the space where young people are participating in politics. So even though we have young people participating in this CNN town hall, to the rest of the young people around the country, how significant is this one event really? From my perspective, it seems like most young people form their political opinions not really based on like the discourse of cable news, and sort of have preconceived opinions based on the policy platforms they've already heard and of their pre-existing knowledge of the candidates. So yeah, that's where I take that.
But is that changing when they have cable news at their fingertips?
Well, I would say that it's sort of gone further than just access, right? I think that young people have just as much access to cable news as they used to, if not more, because of all these new streaming platforms. I just don't think that cable news is as culturally significant to this generation as other forms of media are.
Now, Bernie Sanders said he supported giving felons the right to vote while still in prison, regardless of their crime. Kamala Harris said she'd like to have that discussion, and Pete Buttigieg said he opposed it. Now, is Bernie way out of left field here, or is this going to become a major issue for the campaign?
I think this is pretty on track for Bernie Sanders, just what he's done in the past and what we know of him. I don't think it was a very popular opinion among probably most Democrats and obviously Republicans even. I'm not sure how big of an issue it'll become, but I agree with Kamala Harris. I think we probably should be talking about it, but I don't know if we'll have the same feelings as Bernie Sanders.
Is this an issue you think the voters want to hear about?
So I wouldn't say that they don't want to hear about it so much as other issues are just simply more pressing and would demand more attention. So I think that this might be the type of thing that gains a decent amount of traction as like a topic of conversation on the internet, as like a sort of like hallmark of like Bernie's general approach to politics. But in terms of what actually ends up deciding people's votes and what ends up deciding sort of the momentum of the media discourse, I don't necessarily think that this one issue will sort of be the driving point. I think it's more a symptom than it is a cause.
Impeachment has been in the news lately with the release of the Mueller Report and came up several times during the town halls last night. Elizabeth Warren has stated publicly that she was for impeachment, and Kamala Harris said she believes the same. Is impeachment just a right issue right now? since the Mueller report came out, or do you think it's something that's overblown?
I think it's a very important conversation, and personally, I think it is worth pursuing as a discussion amongst lawmakers who have the power to bring about impeachment. I think overall, though, I don't know how fruitful it would be if they did try to do that, just because of obviously like the political machine and concerns with Congress being dominated by the Republicans, who obviously will support Trump. So I would hope that it could go somewhere, but I just don't think it will.
I agree. I think impeachment is an easy talking point because it's so significant rhetorically, but I don't think it will actually be that significant in practice because of the political constraints that we highlighted earlier.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. We'll be right back.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Go Northwestern, break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, spread for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
At Northwestern University, we are pioneering innovation and achieving excellence across every imaginable discipline. At Northwestern University, the possibilities are endless.
We know the news can be a little overwhelming, so we'd like to catch you up on some stories you might have missed. U.S. Ambassador to Germany Richard Grenell fired a shot at Democratic candidate Pete Buttigieg last week, accusing him of trying to capitalize on Vice President Pence's stance on homosexuality. Grenell accused Buttigieg of drawing on a, quote, hate hoax, similar to that of Jussie Smollett. When the South Bend mayor was asked about Grenell's comments last night, he responded by saying, quote, I'm not a master fisherman, but I know bait when I see it, and I'm not going to take it.
Washington State Governor Jay Inslee signed a bill last Friday that will strongly encourage schools to teach students about the Holocaust. The bill does not require schools to talk about the genocide, but it will now be recommended curriculum for middle and high schools across the Evergreen State. Inslee says that it was, quote, hard to smile given the significance of this, but I do feel that this is something people should feel good about.
Ukrainian comedian Volodymyr Zelensky will now be the most powerful man in the Eastern European nation. He defeated incumbent President Petro Poroshenko after taking 73% of the vote in a runoff election. Zelensky was best known for playing a character who accidentally becomes president in the satirical television series Servant of the People, but it's no joke now. Zelensky said he decided to go into politics to change the dynamic and sentiment around the political sphere.
Last October, the department store Sears filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and had to close 700 stores across the country. But it's now suing former CEO Eddie Lampert and Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin for stealing billions of dollars. The lawsuit alleges that Lampert, quote, caused more than $2 billion of assets to be transferred to himself.
And to end our panel on a fun note, we're playing a game we introduced back in March, Head Lies. We'll read you guys 3 headlines, 2 of them fake, 1 of them real, and y'all have to figure out which one is real. You guys ready?
I think we actually know the answers.
I know the answer. I didn't know the answer last time. I know the answer this time.
All right.
All right. First, the U.S. Navy is drafting new guidelines for reporting UFOs in order to work toward destigmatizing unexplained aircraft sightings. Second, South Bend mayor and 2020 Democratic presidential nominee Pete Buttigieg retracted a statement he made during last night's CNN town hall regarding voting rights for incarcerated people. He changed his stance and explained he would support voting rights for incarcerated people. And finally, on Earth Day, Starbucks CEO announces they are going green. Starbucks stores will introduce biodegradable cups to phase out their plastic cups for cold beverages. Which one do you guys think is true?
I'm going to say the first one is true.
The first one. All right,
Yes.
Virginia.
Nope, it's Mia now.
Oh, Virginia's
You
off that.
switched on
Mia.
you. I'm going to say it's the Starbucks one. That's true.
The Starbucks one is indeed false. The true one is the U.S. Navy drafting new guidelines.
We gave away the Pete Buttigieg one earlier in the show. We didn't do a great job of hiding that. Anyway, okay. We'll give Mia another shot.
Mia, not Virginia.
Not
Mia.
Virginia. Okay, here we go. First, NOLA.com published a quiz this week that had people guess whether statements were made by Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana or cartoon character Foghorn Leghorn. That's not John F. Kennedy, just to be clear. Next, Elon Musk recommended using holograms of candidates during debates so candidates would not have to travel to debate sites. And third, in response to Twitter threads comparing the Mueller Report to celebrity outfits, Gucci has announced a series of outfits genuinely based on popular political figures. Which is true.
Honestly, I'm not familiar with Foghorn Leghorn, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it's the first one.
Confession, I have no idea who that is.
I'm going to go with Gucci. I have a feeling.
All right, Foghorn Leghorn is true.
Great.
A lot of our staff took the quiz. Apparently, it's very entertaining. I'd like to see the Gucci outfit, so Gucci, if you're watching. All right, thank you for playing along. That's all we have for right now.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Go Northwestern, break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
Before our final word tonight, we'd like to talk a little bit about Joe Biden, who just announced that he will be running on Thursday. Now, do you guys think Joe Biden stands a chance in these primaries, in this election, and why did he wait so long to announce that he's running?
I think he definitely stands a chance. I think it would not be smart to write him off this early simply because it's a big field. He has a lot of name recognition. He has an association with a certain type of Rust Belt voter that, correctly or incorrectly, many people think is going to decide the 2020 election. And insofar as that's true, I think that a lot of people might vote for him simply on their perception of his electability. Whether or not that's the right call is a separate question.
I mean, there have been talks that Biden is going to announce that he's only going to be running for one term. If he were to be elected, he would not seek re-election, and even that he might announce a vice president very early. Do you think this is a wise strategy for him?
I think that's an interesting strategy. I don't know. I think Biden himself has quite a lot of possibility of winning. I think he has a lot of obviously name recognition, his association with Obama, but I think his running will definitely divide probably more progressive Democrats who want to see something new, fresh, with more establishment people. Obviously, he's been in power in the past. So I don't know. I think he'll certainly shake things up and maybe kind of split people off.
There's been this big push since the 2016 election to get young people out to the polls. And do you think having someone who you can't connect with in terms of youthness and energy, do you think that will further divide an age group and an age gap?
I think it's interesting. Joe Biden specifically in the past is kind of, even though he is an old man, has been seen kind of as like a young, fun, like Uncle Joe. Obviously, he's had, some controversies come up more recently, but especially his association with Obama, people kind of think of him as like a cool, like older grandpa or something. So I don't know. I feel like maybe that won't deter young people who like him from voting for him. They can still see him in that way. But overall, in comparison, he obviously is just not as young and fresh as some of the other candidates. So that could hurt him in that respect.
And Mia, you just described him as young, fun Uncle Joe. Do you think that's still relevant given that there are now actual young candidates in the election like Beto O'Rourke and Pete Buttigieg?
I think it entirely depends on what kind of campaign Biden runs. I think that he could very easily try and position himself, I'm not sure how successfully, as sort of like the old guy who's like down with the kids. But he might also not want to pursue that strategy in favor of positioning himself as like sort of the experienced counterweight to a 4 years of political dysfunction. And I also don't think that we can decide at this point which of those strategies is going to be most successful, because it also depends on the strategies employed by other Democratic candidates and on the general political zeitgeist going into the general election. So yeah, I think that there's no clean answer to that question. I think it just depends on what Joe Biden wants.
All right, thanks you so much to our panel for joining us, and now let's move on to our final word for tonight. On Thursday night, journalist Lyra McKee was killed in Derry, Northern Ireland. McKee was shot while covering riots in the city linked to an Easter celebration of an Irish revolt against British forces in 1916. The Irish independence group New IRA has claimed responsibility for the attack.
McKee was a prominent journalist in Northern Ireland who covered the lasting legacy of the Troubles in Ireland and wrote about her own experience as a young lesbian. McKee's death reminds us that journalism is becoming an increasingly dangerous career. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 78 journalists were killed in 2018 alone, compared to 67 the year before. And the violence appears to be spreading outside of areas of active conflict, where journalists have long faced violence and death. In 2018, the United States had the 5th highest number of journalist deaths worldwide.
Some cite the internet as an influencing factor. 20 years ago, a terrorist or terrorist group would need a journalist reporting on them to spread their message to the world. Now, the same ends can be met through social media, lessening the value of a live journalist. And while the two aren't definitely linked, anti-press rhetoric from those in authority can create an implicit sense of permissiveness toward the violence against journalists. As of today, the United States ranking on the 2019 World Press Freedom Index is 48, down 3 spots from 2018 and 5 from 2017. The organization that puts out the rankings, Reporters Without Borders, cites President Trump's enemy of the people rhetoric as a reason for the drop. That's all the time we have for tonight. I'm Justin Sweetwood.
And I'm Joey Safchik. Thanks for watching and supporting local journalism.